You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with MEMO. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host today. We are discussing radicalization and specifically the UK government's counter-extremism strategy known as PREVENT, its origins, its evolution, and the impact it's having, not just in the UK, but also globally. I am joined by Dr. Rob Faure Walker. Rob has a PhD from UCL and runs a website, Prevent Digest, which is an independent non-profit organization that has been gathering evidence on the impact of PREVENT. His new book, which is really the topic of our discussion today, The Emergence of Extremism, Exposing the Violent Discourse, and Language of Radicalization. It was released last year. In the book, he questions the orthodox thinking about extremism and radicalization and the negative impact this has had on society and British politics at large, and I would say globally as well. So welcome to the show, Rob.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for that introduction.
No, thank you. Let me just go back and just speak about how I came across your book. Of course, a couple of, I think 5-6 weeks ago now, we had the Trojan horse scandal, and I've been thinking a lot about that, and also generally about the broader aspect of radicalization and extremism and how it's being used by governments all over the world, from the Middle East and China, from democracies here in the UK and also in the US, how this narrative, how this discourse is being used to crack down on free speech, crack down on pro-Palestinian activism, and also pro-democracy activism in various parts of the world. That's where I see your book, and your book is an amazing case study on how that is happening in the UK, in classrooms, and of course in wider society. We will speak about the broader implication, but I want to start off by asking you a question about your own personal experience, because you are a teacher. You've been teaching for many years in schools in Tower Hamlets, which is an area in London. And then you mentioned in your book that there was a moment when the UK government had ordered you as teachers, as civil servants, to spy on your students. So tell us about that moment and the motivations for putting this book together.
So it happens first happens in 2014, was when I was teaching. So I'm not teaching anymore, I now work at UCL, but when I was teaching in Tower Hamlets, and I'd been teaching for 10 years or so. And in 2014, the school suddenly had to implement the PREVENT duty. And this came off the back of the Trojan horse affair, Trojan horse hoax, if you want to call it that, because it was a hoax in Birmingham, which was the suggestion in 2013 that some of the schools in Birmingham, with Parkview at the centre, had been infiltrated by so-called, and I'm going to put heavy scare quotes on this, Islamic extremists. Because I think, if you ever meet Tahir Alam, who's the person at the centre of this, or any of the other teachers at the centre of this, they are, they're devout, well-meaning Muslims. I think the idea that they should be, slandered in such ways is absurd. They've done a fantastic job with turning around the schools in Birmingham. But anyway, not to go into too much of that, but there was this kind of mass hysteria, this moral panic that the schools in Birmingham were being taken over by an Islamic worldview, which, I mean, I suppose just to say a little bit on that, one of the main misrepresentations around that is that schools in Britain are secular. Schools in Britain are not secular, and never have been. In fact, it's the duty of schools to have acts of collective worship that represent the community that they serve. So it's quite right that the schools in Birmingham had, gave the kids time to pray, allowed for, they were altering the school day around Ramadan, things like that. And that's what we were doing in the school that I was working in, Tower Hamlets. one of the reasons that the schools in Tower Hamlets, like the schools in Birmingham, were so successful was because they were actively trying to be representative of the communities that they served. The problem seemed to be within this kind of Islamophobic society that we live in, that representation was of Islam. And so anyway, so we got told by the government that we had to implement the Prevent duty in our schools. Prevent had been around for it had nearly been around for exactly a decade by this point anyway, as a strategy to combat radicalisation, again in heavy scare quotes, that's a ridiculous idea. But as a strategy to combat radicalisation, it had been around for 10 years. But it was only with the Trojan Horse affair where the schools inspector at Ofsted were sent in to essentially, shut down those schools in the way that they were operating, get rid of the leadership in those schools, get rid of the governors and replace them. And the reports that came out of Birmingham from the Trojan Horse affair all said that the schools, to pass their Ofsted inspections in the future, had to implement the Prevent strategy. And the thing you have to understand about this is that when Ofsted, the schools inspectorate, say jump, schools and head teachers say how high, because they have immense power to, if Ofsted fails a school's inspection, the head teacher is probably losing their job. The teacher is going to be put under a huge amount of extra work, stress, and everything like that. So without much opportunity to criticise what was going on, the schools in Tower Hamlets in 2014 quickly wrote their Prevent strategies. And so that led to me as the teacher and all of my 100 or so other teaching colleagues, or a couple of hundred teaching and other staff in the school, receiving training in Prevent. And that training involved just deeply Islamophobic discussions about how, if an older Muslim kid was growing their beard long, or then that might be a sign of Islamic extremism. If they were praying more, it might be a sign of Islamic extremism. Essentially, basic identifiers of being Muslim were cited as indicators of extremism. And let's just break down.
So if I can quickly interrupt, Rob. So what was informing those ideas that if a Muslim person grows a beard, or someone shows solidarity with, say, Palestine, or someone does really well in his exam all of a sudden, or does really poorly in his exam? What was informing this kind of research?
Just to pick up that final point, and to show how ridiculous it was. In that initial Prevent training that I had, I was told by the Prevent trainer that, all the teachers were told by the Prevent trainer that a sign of exam grades going down or a sign of exam grades going up could be an indication for radicalisation. So they're basically saying, like, any indication that you're a human, and you might be, so that you get these ridiculous things creeping in, which essentially things like that are basically made up by the trainer on the spot, because there's a lot of stuff in Prevent training in counter-extremism, and we're seeing it more in counter-terrorism messaging more generally. They talk about trusting your gut. It's about, which is essentially saying, let your prejudice run loose. But where these originally come from, these signs of extremism, or are from, there's a government document, the ERG, the Extremism Risk Guidelines 21 plus, whether it's 21 or 22 indicators of extremism. Where they come from a research paper that was published. It wasn't peer reviewed. It was published by a couple of psychologists who had done a study where they had looked at convicted Muslim terrorists in prison. They'd taken a very small sample size, so a handful of people. They'd interviewed them. And what they then did is that they found these 20 or so factors that they all shared these similar factors, that they were, they were praying 5 times a day, some of them had beards, etc., etc. And the authors of that report have since said that that these are not appropriate indicators of future acts of terrorism for a number of reasons. Firstly, their sample that they selected were convicted Muslims. So your starting point is that you're identifying your common features are people being Muslim, but they then kind of retro-engineered that. What the government has done is they've taken those indicators and retro-engineered them to say that these are now indicators of terrorism, which is just, rationally and scientifically totally unsound. It doesn't don't mean that those characteristics have been driving. It's absurd. I mean, it's absurd as saying. I mean, just to flesh out that logic, it's a bit like saying the Queen is a posh woman, so all posh women are the Queen. Like that's how flawed the logic is of doing that. Anyway, so we had this prevent training, and I remember at the time I argued with the person who was delivering the training. They got a pretty hard time actually from the school that I was in, because I think quite a lot of us had already been talking about how ridiculous and how dangerous what was going on in Birmingham was with the Trojan horse. So they got a pretty hard time. I spoke out against what was being done, and then sort of things moved on. But this was at the same time as as I said this before, as the Trojan horse affair was going on in Birmingham. And there was one thing that I want to talk about that happened around that time, was that it was the day after Michael Gove and Theresa May they infamously had a big kind of argument in the House of Parliament, where they were arguing about how to address this supposed threat of Islamic extremism. And what that led to is it's a perfect example of kind of politicians leading the media, and the media kind of fomenting this kind of hysteria and the racism as well. Is that it was the next morning that all of the front pages of all the newspapers had kind of these really Islamophobic front pages about the Trojan horse plot and all the the other stuff that we kind of become familiar with. And that morning, when I saw my form class in school, there was this kind of hushed silence. There was this sort of hushed conversation going on in the class, and a sort of everyone was I don't know, there was a tension in the class. And eventually I sort of said, what's going on? And started talking to people. And it turned out that lots of the girls had saliva on the back of their hijabs. And we got talking about it. And more than they usually were, those children, and it can't be emphasized enough, those children had suffered from Islamophobic verbal abuse, and evidently, I mean, I think you'd call it physical abuse, had been spat on their way into school. And notably more so than normally happened. So it was a really good example of how that kind of political, then media rhetoric turns into street level racism. And so that's sort of, this is all going on in the school at the time. So I think I was very quick to speak out against Prevent. And I wrote a few articles for kind of online publications. I helped produce a research paper for Rights Watch UK, which is now Rights and Security, which is a kind of civil liberties NGO. And that led me to I was going to quote it a few times in the national press, speaking out against Prevent. And what that did was it ended up placing me in this very privileged position, because we went from, around the time that Prevent was introduced, there was this marked change in the dynamic in the classrooms, that Muslim kids universally stopped engaging in political conversation. As you pointed out before, kids kind of already knew that there had been Prevent referrals. So that's people being referred to the police for talking about Israel, Palestine, for criticizing Israel. And so kids didn't dare speak out politically, particularly Muslim kids. And in the school I was teaching in, it was majority Muslim kids. So when you're left with only the two white kids in the class speaking out, you notice it. It's obvious that's happening. But what happened very soon after that, after I was kind of cited in the press speaking out against Prevent, is I suddenly had kids, not during class time, but at break time and at lunchtime. I'd have kids that I'd never met before in the school would come and knock on my door and come and have a chat, and would explain that they were also kind of nervous about Prevent. And they'd start. So these political conversations started started re-emerging. I found myself in this privileged position where the kids were coming and actually talking to me about their concerns about Prevent and about the fact that they were being silenced. And the interesting thing for me about that, or the disturbing thing, I suppose, as well, was that at the same time, you had politicians, people that worked for Prevent, all saying that this idea that there's this chilling effect from Prevent is not true. Prevent doesn't silence kids, and it's very easy for them to say that, because without being in that kind of privileged position I was in, where the kids were telling me that they were scared and that they weren't speaking out, then there isn't really any evidence of that. There's never any evidence for a negative. The absence of conversation isn't evidence. So I do think, I think there's something quite important to recognise here, is that I think a lot of Prevent workers are. I'm trying to work out how to put this, because maybe it sounds ridiculous, but I think they're almost acting in racist good faith. Like there's like this ingrained, there's like, we know that this country has a racist and Islamophobic disposition, but they kind of believe in what they're doing, and I think you can kind of this is a good opportunity to sort of explain what Prevent, the other aspects of Prevent, because there's not just the reporting aspect of Prevent. Prevent also in schools has schools have to write into their curriculum that they're doing kind of anti-radicalisation work, that they are. So I'll give you one example.
So how does just to interrupt again? So what kind of effect did that have in the classroom? I mean, I want to connect that to an experience of my own kids who in their own school during last Gaza onslaught during last Ramadan 2001. Police officer came to their school and said that basically, they shouldn't be showing solidarity to Palestinians in, like, for example, holding fundraising, wearing flags and things like this. So you had this kind of policing of solidarity with the Palestinians. But you as a teacher who want to encourage freedom of expression, who know the importance of children being able to air their feelings and their views is actually healthy for society. How do you balance the two? And also keeping in mind what's happening right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because to me, when I look at that and I see how freely kids will be able to speak about this, while on the other hand, on the other issues like Palestine, like Syria, like the US invasion of Iraq, the views have been suppressed throughout the years. So I think at a very young age, I think kids will develop this sense that governments are hypocrites, and they look at the hypocrisy and develop a cynicism which probably isn't healthy to have when you're a very young age. So there's all these things playing out now, I think, in the minds of kids in schools, knowing that there are certain feelings which they have to suppress and certain views and opinions which they can speak freely because it conforms with the mainstream narrative. So there's a lot there. I mean, just speak about that. It's incredible. I mean, the whole idea of Prevent is incredibly problematic, and I think is exactly as you said. I think that this week we're in a very sort of strong position to critique what's going on, because there is the double standards are so clear now, where you're getting people told, as you said, the police coming in and the government were essentially commissioning themselves. They were commissioning people that had previously worked for the government and set up consultancies, like organisations like Solutions Not Sides at the time that you're talking about, to come into schools and tell children that criticising
Israel as an occupying force is anti-Semitic, which is just wrong. It's just wrong. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize an occupying force, whether it's Israel or Russia or anywhere else. And as we've seen that this week, the government are encouraging people to criticize the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is absolutely right. We should be encouraged. We should be criticizing that and doing what we can to stand against it. I think just to sort of take that thought further, the real danger of this, and I've already seen it in my interactions online and even with friends in person this week, is that what happens when you have the allowing the criticism of Russia and not allowing the criticism of Israel are they're connected. Those that they are what you're essentially allowing that, as you said, allowing the mainstream narrative, and you're imposing a kind of good and bad or good and evil mindset on the world. It's this idea that we must have very harsh judgment of any given situation, and that's where the analysis ends. And the really dangerous thing for that is that it doesn't allow you to present a deeper analysis. So, for example, I've got in trouble this week with people for suggesting that that we need to understand Russia's actions, and we need to understand that in the context of NATO. We need to consider NATO expansion in the last decade, and we need to understand why Russia is opposing that and has gone on the offensive in opposition to that. And you're immediately accused of being an apologist for Russia, and in the same way that you get those ideas of being an apologist for terrorism if you speak out against Israel or whatever. And it's just incredibly dangerous, because it does mean that we're never going to be able to settle differences, and we're just confined to eternal conflict if we're not allowed to analyze what's going on. And so, to bring it back to prevent is putting that on a statutory footing in schools. You're not allowed to analyze political relations freely. And that's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous now for the way that it isolates children, that it alienates them from their own political reality. And it's incredibly dangerous for the future, that we are trying to raise a whole generation without the language or the ability to understand the world correctly. I think the one great hope actually is that prevent will always fail, because people do have an innate sense of justice. People do have an innate sense of critique and wanting to understand the deeper realities of the world. So I think that prevent is doomed to fail. But unfortunately, in that failure, it means that it just ends up alienating more and more people from the state. If it's so clear to everyone that prevent is hypocritical and is harmful.
Mm. Yeah, reading your book, I particularly enjoyed that section where you trace the origins of the evolution of the term extremism and radicalization in your book. Both terms, of course, is what's animating prevent and policies to counter radicalization in big scare quotes. You mentioned there are many iterations throughout history. But give us just a flavor of how radicalization and extremism was used and deployed pre 9/11 and post 9/11.
Yeah, so this was the reason I kind of wrote the book actually, is that I went from being very frustrated and speaking about prevent on a kind of personal and professional level as a teacher to starting to look into where extremism came from. And actually, this is where you kind of hope when you do research that you'll find out something new. And this was, I guess, the thing that I did find out that was new was that if you look back over the last 100 years of sort of political speeches, so looking at parliamentary speeches and government documents, the word extremism before, so let's say before 9/11, is used in a very specific way. It's generally used by it's used by politicians on both sides, so conservatives and left-wing politicians. What you get particularly in the first half of the 20th century in Parliament are left-wing politicians will say to right-wing politicians, so the conservative politicians who tend to be in government, they say to them, as they're trying to enact some kind of oppressive policy, they say to them, and this is all on the parliamentary record, they say, you want to watch out enacting this policy, because if you enact this policy, there will be a radicalization, there'll be an increase in extremism, which means that people will vote for us. So the left always saw themselves as the opposition. So they placed themselves as, our job is to be effective opposition. And that's confirmed by, in the late 1950s, there's one particular quote that's in the book, which is incredible, which is where there is a Labour politician who, after the Labour government have bought in the welfare state, so they bought in the NHS, they bought in benefits to support people, and the country is generally better off. There is a greater sense of social justice in Britain. This Labour politician says that we need to celebrate the loss of red patches on the map. So they're saying after an election where Labour has been defeated, this is a great success because the Labour Party has delivered a sense of social justice. So people are now voting for the traditional government in power, so the Conservatives. And then we get a real shift happens. And this is not, I'm not just saying this as, this isn't just hyperbole. I'm saying this is what the data showed me as I was reading through these endless passages of parliamentary speech, is that the first time that extremism is used in a different way is by Tony Blair in his maiden speech to Parliament in 1983, where he says that we want to watch out for the extremists in the party. And the extremists in the party are the people who are like union leaders and people who are pushing for change. And he says, watch out for those extremists. And it's the first time that we get a Labour politician very obviously aiming to be in government. So traditionally, Labour acts in opposition to shift the parliamentary debates rather than to be in power. And we then get that, we then know the kind of history of this as New Labour come into power. He's going to be in power, and to get in power, Labour have to shift to the right. So he takes the party to the right. They get into power, and again we can see Tony Blair. So it's actually, there's very little reference to extremism or radicalisation around 9/11. I think as part of my research, I analysed about 1 million words of newspaper text in the week after 9/11. And I found one reference to extremism in 1 million words of commentary on 9/11. So it's just not there. It's not something that's discussed. After the 7/7 bombings, so the London bombings in 2005, Tony Blair gives a speech within hours of the bombings in which he says that the cause of this is extremism. And so he's now gone. That was his moment where the prevent strategy had already been described within cabinet meetings with Tony Blair a year before. But then when those bombs in London happened, that was the moment in which the Labour government go full scale ahead with creating this, a counter-extremism strategy and creating the prevent strategy or getting the prevent strategy written up and disseminated. And then once they've done that, once they have designated extremism as this kind of, it's like a sort of bogeyman kind of thing. It's this sort of mythical thing, extremism that is out there and is scary. And it
wasn't also, sorry, Rob, was it just to focus that point? Yeah. Wasn't it also the time when discussions about extremism moved from violent terrorism to extremism as this, broad vague definitions. So the violence was dropped.
So that comes a little bit later. So this is the new Labour strategy in 2000 around 2007, and we then get a much more use of extreme. But the key here is that as soon as you've got extremism, it goes back to that point that I was making earlier about good and bad or good and evil. We suddenly got this extremism. As soon as someone says extremism, you then apply no further analysis. It's just accepted that that's a bad thing. And then you're quite right, though. We then get to, in 2010, the coalition government. That was when Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives formed the government. And they then revise it, and they then write the strategy, which drops the new Labour strategy was about violent extremism. The current Prevent strategy that was written by the coalition government is purely about extremism. So they've dropped the violence. And that begs a number of questions. And the main one for me is, what place can a strategy to counter extremism have in a democracy? And it can't have a place. It is not acceptable. It's not compatible with democracy to define any ideas as extreme. The whole point of a democracy is that we hear everyone's views, and we then thrash them out, and we decide what's best. And I'm obviously, I think it's quite right in there is nothing is as simple as this within politics, and there is obviously a place for saying, like, there ought not to be hate speech. I agree with that. I think that we shouldn't be allowed to incite hatred against other people, but that's not what extremism is. And I think it's an interesting thing to pick up on, though, because we do have in this country incredibly effective criminal law against hate speech. So you can't just say something that's going to lead to other people harming other people, or is going to lead to denouncing someone for a certain protected characteristics, be that religion or disability or race or whatever. We've already got criminal laws that protect against that. So any strategy to counter extremism is purely a political tool, and it's a political tool to silence dissent. And it's for that reason, to kind of go back to your earlier point, is why it's been exported so readily around the world. So, ideas around counter-extremism very much start with the UK. They then kind of are developed in tandem with the US, but they're quickly lapped up by governments around the world, whether that be Myanmar to be used against Rohingya Muslims, whether that be in India to be used against Kashmiri Muslims, whether that be in China to be used against Uyghur Muslims. Like, all of these states, the existence or the development of counter-extremism of Prevent in the UK gives these states license to unleash Islamophobia within their own legislation. And it's also just worth pointing out that it gets slightly more sinister than that, because there are the British government have, and you can find this on government websites, the British government have been holding conferences over the last few years with the Indian government to promote counter-extremism. So that again has enabled all of the BJP Islamophobia, the Hindu nationalism, has been actively enabled by the British government, actively encouraged by the British government, and also very similarly, again, this is not. I think the government have kind of tried to hide this because they've removed it from government websites, but actually it's stored on the Internet Archive on Wayback Machine. Is that the government, the UK Border Agency, carried out training in counter-extremism in Xinjiang, where there are now millions of Uyghur Muslims being held in concentration camps. The British government, through the UK Border Agency, gave training to the Chinese government in counter-extremism in advance of that happening. So
it's extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's not really written about very much. This, I mean, if you could have touched on it, I write about it a little bit. But it is. We are actively promoting these things around the world, and it is as horrific as it sounds.
Yeah, just to end our conversation, Rob, with a question about. We've spoken about Prevent, how nefarious it's been. And you also mentioned in your book that it's not really been effective. It's been counterproductive, if anything. So the question really is who benefits? You quote Upton Sinclair in your book. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. So I think that's kind of summarizes what Prevent is all about. There are people out there who are pushing this idea, whose even though it's counterproductive, the salary depends on them pushing this narrative. So who really benefits in your view?
So I think there's two ways in which I need to answer that question. The first is you're exactly right. There's this whole industry around counter-extremism and Prevent, and there's these massive government contracts, and it's just, it's rife. I've been watching this area and researching it for the last sort of nearly a decade now, and constantly you see people going from being government employees of Prevent to going and setting up consultancies to sell Prevent back into schools, to going back into working in government, or you see, police officers who've been working in Prevent and they go and set up their own consultancy to then get paid by the government to go and sell Prevent back into schools. So there's this whole kind of this really flourishing economy. It can't be explained enough how profitable this economy is, because the government are just, at the same time as austerity has stripped away funding for theatre clubs, sports clubs, youth clubs, the money's there for Prevent work, which is why you get, I was very careful not to criticise Prevent-funded community groups too much, because you see people who are doing, I can think of some really great organisations that do kind of drugs rehabilitation work and things like that, who've had to take Prevent funding to keep going. And I personally don't think they ever should have taken that funding, but at the same time, that was as austerity took away their funding. Otherwise, they got that funding in. So there's people who just their job depends on it, and that's become more profound over the last 7 or 8 years. Because when I was first, I'm trying to think how long ago, about 8 years ago, when I was first talking to Prevent workers, these were people who'd been doing those jobs for a few years. They weren't, they'd been doing those jobs for a few years. More recently, when I've been at kind of conferences where people have been talking about Prevent and, talking to other people, there are people now who are senior police officers, police chiefs, who have made their career in counter-extremism. And so what you've got here is this really sinister mechanism whereby if you're a police chief on a very high salary with a massive pension, and you've made your whole career in counter-extremism, you're not going to, even if you're doubly driven not to speak out against it, because you've got nowhere to go. You've become, your skill set is in this totally absurd area of policing that shouldn't exist, but you're hardly going to argue against that. So I've definitely noticed that Prevent workers have become more aggressive in their protection of what they do, or in their arguments against critics like me. And I think that's just become because as they've realized how precarious their situation is if it ever does fall down. But the other things to talk about, and I think this is to answer the question about who's benefiting from Prevent and why we still have Prevent, even though it's clearly ineffective, is that, and this comes from a friend of mine who for many years worked for an advertising agency and was running the government's anti-smoking campaigns, kind of going back to the sort of early 2000s. And that was when I don't remember, but lots of big billboards in cities and on roundabouts had these signs like there were sort of disgusting pictures of diseased lungs and things like that, and saying don't smoke. And the interesting thing about those adverts is anyone who at the time used to smoke, they would know that when you saw saw one of those adverts, and you then pulled in to fill up with petrol, you bought a packet of cigarettes because they'd actually advertised smoking to you. Smoking is an addiction. They were totally counterproductive. And this friend of mine who was working in advertising said that over those 10 years of running those adverts, the civil servants who he was working with, they were very interested in the in the research that the advertising agency did to see how effective the adverts were. And so the research was with smokers, and the research for 10 years said that those adverts were totally ineffective. The money should not have been spent by the government on that. It was making more people smoke. It was free advertising for the tobacco industry. What ministers were interested in, so the elected politicians who were making the final decisions, is they wanted to see the polling data of the whole population and what the whole population's opinion of the anti-smoking campaigns was. And the opinion of the whole population was that the government was doing a good job of being tough on bad people. So the smokers are bad people. We're telling them they're bad. People like that. So they kept spending money on this flawed campaign that was being counterproductive. And I think you see Prevent through exactly the same lens. We know it doesn't work. Civil servants know it doesn't work. Most politicians probably know it doesn't work. But what they do know it does is it foments Islamophobia. It makes the general population think that the government are being tough on bad people. It defines the bad person in the devout Muslim, and it does that job for them. So it helps politicians get elected. And that's ultimately the paradigm of the whole war on terror. It's not meant to do what it says on the tin. It's just meant to shore up, domestic power for politicians.
Yeah. So you're basically saying governments need to be seen to be doing something, even though it's not effective. They've adopted a policy which just to be seen to be doing something. Is that kind of...
and there's a whole. I've written a bit about this. That there is a whole. Again, this whole economy has developed of policy-led evidence where government. To use a very specific example, actually, that's pertinent to this conversation. The Policy Exchange is a think tank that was set up by Michael Gove. Michael Gove, infamously Islamophobic politician who fomented the Trojan horse hoax, sets up the Policy Exchange, and he then the Policy Exchange pay right-wing academics to write reports for them, which, because they're written for the Policy Exchange, don't have to fulfill any of the ethical requirements for, say, a piece of university research. So you essentially get these polemic pieces demanding certain pieces of legislation. For example, that Prevent gets used. There's one that Policy Exchange did. They write a report saying that Prevent needs to be used against environmental protesters, like people for Extinction Rebellion. No one questions the fact that research was funded by oil companies, but what it allows politicians to then do is they stand up in Parliament, they wave the report about, and they say, look, this research, again, heavy scare quotes, says that we need to do this, and we're going to do this. So there's this really cynical machinery at work, a cynical mechanism where set up a think tank, get it to tell you what you want to say, then as the politician, you use your own think tank that you've set up to say that this is evidence. And all the while, you've kind of shut out any of the kind of independent academic critique of what you're trying to do. Which again, and I think that's probably where it's worth sort of mentioning, is that the vast majority of university academics and researchers are opposed to Prevent. There's very, very little in support of Prevent, other than by a small handful of academics who, when you dig into their funding, are funded by the government. But any independent research, there's no independent research that supports Prevent. Yet again, there's these kind of sinister mechanisms to enable it to perpetuate.
Yeah. We are out of time, Rob. So I want to thank you. It's been a really enlightening conversation. Amazing, thrilling, but also at times quite scary, uneasy. The fact that you have a massive policy out there, a strategy which is counterproductive, but governments have been persisting with it, not just the UK, but around the world, even though it's generated more extremism, more hostility, more animosity. So yeah, it's quite a scary time, especially now, but I'm really delighted that you've given us a really good explanation of your book, and I really encourage everyone to purchase your book. So thank you for your time, and thank you for thanks to those who joined us from home, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.